The following is a public preview of the New Models podcast. For our complete library, visit patreon.com/newmodels or newmodels.substack.com.
You're now listening to New Models.
A few weeks ago in Venice, several preeminent thinkers in the field of AI appeared on a panel as part of the Archipelago for Possible Future Summit. The discussion was anchored by a short polemic by Benjamin Bratton, exhorting the audience to greenlight the public infrastructure necessary for AI to flourish as a transnational mega-technology. The conversation was happening in the context of the opening weekend of this year's Venice Architecture Biennale, which, curated by the head of MIT's Sensible City Lab, Carlo Ratti, leaned into AI's crucial role in humanity's future. To face a burning world, Ratti wrote in his opening salvo for the exhibition, architecture must harness all the intelligence around us. Our guest on this episode is scholar Orit Halpern, who is full professor and chair of digital cultures at Technische Universität, Dresden. She is also the author, with Robert Mitchell, of the Smartness mandate, which explores the popular embrace of smartness, as in smartphone, smart city, more or less any computer-mediated technology or place that implements networks of sensors and learning algorithms with the goal of real-time optimization that the rise of machine learning AI required. Or it locates the birth of smartness not in the aughts, but in mid-20th century financial markets and wartime defense research, where an immediate short-term advantage could be achieved through data-ifying the environment and letting an algorithm statistically predict, which is to say, direct, the future. Often in conversations around smartness and machine learning, AI is presented as the natural path of human progress, an evolutionary, almost biological development that emerged out of human communication systems and that has the potential to far exceed them. Often, AI is pitched as either incontrovertibly good, the only way to navigate the complexity of our era, or decidedly dystopian, cue Terminator. What Orit's work offers us, and what should probably be fundamental to any policy discussion about the development of AI infrastructure, is a shared understanding of the technological imaginary that enabled AI's rise, which is to say, the particular intersection of neoliberal theory, psychology, and computer science that generated the economic incentives, political will, and public desire for it to exist in the specific form we have now. On this episode, Orit demystifies AI's technological imaginary by helping us see smartness less as a technological revolution than an organizational one. I'm Carly Busta. My co-host is Lil Internet. Our guest today is scholar Orit Halpern. Let's get into it. Orit Halpern, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm excited.
I almost feel like we should apologize for how we should have
it's
talked to you
actually true.
years ago.
Well, I love anyone who reads my work. I mean, it's already like a real compliment, I mean, reading it all in this day and age.
Yeah, well, that's true.
It's kind
that's
of a
totally
whole
true.
act of resistance in and of itself.
I know. So on this podcast, we've spoken this year to artists and musicians, filmmakers, people who are working on what you might call the content level of cultural production. But all of them are trying to get outside of it. All of them realize that the content level is somehow fraught. And one thing that your work does really well is it helps us build a technological imaginary. Flusser is someone who's been important to the conversations we've had here. And you published this book in 2023 with Robert Mitchell called The Smartness Mandate. Smartness as in smartphone, smart home, smart city. That was a key term during the aughts and the teens. But now we speak about artificial intelligence or machine learning. And I wonder if you could do a really brief definition of what smartness is and how it corresponds to what we now speak of these systems as intelligence.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this question, and obviously the two are really closely married in the sense of both the history, but also I think they denote radically different things and maybe suggest transformations in both geopolitics and political economy that we need to attend to. So in many ways, smartness is a more ambiguous term. Its history is not as closely linked to histories of quantifying and rationalizing intelligence as intelligence, which is really linked to things like IQ tests and the kind of specification or desire to actually define human reason in terms of numbers or in terms of very, very highly delineated variables. Smartness, for example, when we looked at the use of the term, it tends to take on environmental connotations. Like it's not as anthropomorphic. The first use was always around smart telephony, actually. I think there was the use of smartphones by IBM, something like back in the 70s or 80s. There's also, as you've mentioned, there's the smartphone, which denotes a sort of networked concept, but also the smart home, smart environments, smart cities. So this is sort of a different scale in some sense than how historically we define intelligence, but also smartness has these other ambiguities, like the idea mostly around the 70s of street style. You look smart today.
Right.
That idea of being smart denotes more like a colloquialism, like I have street smarts, I have intuition. It's not exactly the same idea of a rational, replicatable decision making as we might think either from thinking about IQ or the other side of it, which is things like game theory, where you really have these highly organized and structured scenarios where decision making is made under highly constrained and specified conditions. So in many ways, smartness is more environmental, a little bit less specific. And also, I think for a lot of the corporations and pundits of smartness, more consumer friendly. Like it didn't have the Terminator discussion around it. It didn't have like scary machines. It's all about my smart oven, my smartphone, my smart things that make my life nicer, but also maybe augment that everyday sensibility of having street smarts or a thing like that. These are the kind of subliminal things. However, we can't ignore the fact that you couldn't really have AI without smartness, without the infrastructure for data collection, most particularly through the phone. Just to be really pragmatic, the smartphone is probably the one technology that really transformed computing infrastructurally in terms of data collection. It allows GIS and GPS integration. It allows all this data collection on everyday behavior and actions. But of course, also across the board, the levels of sensors and data collection that are mandatory to make the data sets of AI work came through this prehistory, if you will, of datafying the environment through the discourse of smartness. So we have to see these two as integrally linked infrastructurally, although we do have to say that AI has taken on a particular discussion, not about environments and lifestyle and consumption, but actually really around the future of the human. And its discourses have been stellarly dystopic and eugenic. And so AI has really taken on cadences around the singularity, species extinction, species survival. Like it's always framed in terms of which nation's going to have the most AI to beat the others. So China versus the US. So you see a real shift there from a consumerist, abundant vision of technology to this far more evolutionary biological discourse that's very much framed in terms of species level survival. I think that's one of the key features, and that fits very well with the kind of reactionary politics that seems to accompany AI, the way people are talking about pronatalism or aging, or there's a whole population discourse that's following the AI thing as well. You can't really separate it. Now, the fact is AI doesn't have to be framed that way. And I think one of the questions is How do we think about the relationship between intelligence and smartness? How do we think about the affordances these terms develop for us in terms of thinking about environments as lively, as agents, as conversations? How do we think about the idea that networks can take on certain forms of sentience? And how do we imagine decision-making and agency for humans, and which humans, of course, as well as other entities within these networks? Those are all up for contest. So that was a very dystopian read coming from the current political moment, where you have to see the AI discourse really emerging with a pretty powerful reactionary politics. You really have to ask yourself what's at stake in each of these terms.
Totally. You start hinting at the second part of your book title, which is mandate. Like, why do we take these technologies as inevitable and progressive, as though it's the natural course of human evolution? Perhaps we could go back and we could ask you about the origins of smartness.
Earlier in your career, you worked in public health. And I heard you mention on a previous podcast that certain experience working in that sector led you to your current critical practice and history of science with a focus on cybernetics and data-oriented epistemologies. And I could not find the story of what realization or problem or question inspired you to start researching these histories. Maybe you could share it with us?
Oh, yeah, sure. I came out of, actually, I had a master's in public health from Columbia University, and I was working in international development, particularly in reproductive health and rights and HIV/AIDS. And that got me very interested in the politics, if you will, of development, but also of how sexuality, technology, and medicine intersect. And also, of course, these questions about the relation between global north, global south, the kind of problematic nature of international development in terms of positing certain ideas of progress at the cost of others, particularly because I started my career working for agencies supported by the World Bank. So there were real questions about neoliberal development. And I don't want to say everything was bad. I actually want to say there's a lot of great people working in international development. Like, I'm not for the destruction of USAID or anything. But I came out of there with questions, obviously, about how people understood progress and its relationship to technology and its relationship to sexual, racial, cultural difference. Ultimately, I ended up working on computing more than on the public health side, but thinking about smartness and artificial intelligence and big data in general. Increasingly, I'm going back to the fundamental question, which is true of public health and true of AI, which is it's about big groups of people. It's about big populations of data. What it means to work in a world with big data and grouping people and things into data sets, that became like a central core topic. And so that's coming back with force, because right now, a very central part of the politics of AI is actually around population, whether it's immigration or this whole sudden crisis of an overly old population. Why are those things together? Like, shouldn't AI be able to solve these problems? I mean, after all, automate labor, like produce more value. Why would you have a labor shortage in an age where supposedly these machines are replacing labor? We have to ask those questions because they're shaping the technology and they're shaping the politics right now.
There are a number of questions that I want to ask from here, including going back even further with this idea that intelligence and smartness, people speak about it as a 21st century issue, but in fact, like, the logic of this goes back much, much farther. But this difference between the individual and populations is really rich for the reasons that you just specified. But I wanted to ask you about this contradiction where smartness and now AI and machine learning is often pitched or explained or marketed towards an individual. This is your personal assistant. This is your own smartphone, which is like, you hold in your hand. It needs your biometrics. But smartness and now machine learning, it's only good if all of us are in it. It needs all of us represented in it. It needs as many as possible. And then it also, of course, reduces populations to statistics. How do you understand this conflict between smartness serving an individual, and yet thinking in terms of populations?
I mean, that's a really complicated question. And it's also a particular moment, and I'm overly American in my analysis, I know that, where one feels that the erosion of civil rights and of that legal system is definitely under attack right now. And that we have to try to understand, again, the relationship between that attack and the technology and how that's feeding into maybe ideas of individualism that are no longer related to civil rights or maybe even older Enlightenment frameworks of human specialness or spirit or any of these things. Since World War II, there's been a critique of humans as good decision makers that basically, under the pressure of high-speed warfare, people began to realize that individuals don't make good decisions, that pilots always go the wrong direction and get shot down, that people having to deal with complex systems and very large armies can't always see what they're doing in the fog of war. And also that people voted for fascists, like that democracy itself seemed actually flawed in terms of decision making. And that critique of decision making became also technology. And it first saw itself developed in a technology called game theory, which was an effort to quantify, rationalize, automate decision-making in a computational way, because it was viewed that humans actually make bad decisions. So we need to find processes, preferably mathematical ones or logical ones, that might be able to rectify the errors of emotional judgment. And particularly this came up around nuclear war, because here we are making decisions about the fate of the human race with this amazing technology. We need to find ways to account for the individual biases and emotional cadences or what have you of individual decision makers. So the effort there was to create sets of mathematical problems or scenarios that allow you to work through making a decision under imperfect information. And the classic case being prisoner's dilemma, right? Where you're trying to figure out, without knowing what the other prisoner is doing, what the best response will be to get the best judgment out of the situation. So we have to see these AIs and everything in the legacy of a rising idea that humans are actually imperfect decision makers and that the machines can come in and assist and aid in that decision making. And that takes a softer, friendlier face as we go through the 60s and 70s, and computing's just added to corporate management, and it becomes a managerial assistant. It becomes an admin assistant. It becomes an assistant to what we do. It assists our decision-making, our daily tasks, because we can't do it all, and that continues to be the tone, right, of my personal assistant, that Alexa or whoever is going to check in and do it for me, because there's a limit to my cognitive capacities in an increasingly complex world. So I think that is part of this individualized side. And the reverse side that you're talking about is the way the technology actually works, which is it demands really large data sets to learn from. Like we all understand how we use our personal assistant. Getting to the big data politics and the structural reorganization of the economy, and just generally the question of oligarchy, which is frankly what's going on right now, and who owns the data and who will own the data and who will even own the infrastructure. I mean, right now you're seeing an amazing integration between smartness and AI, because you need that infrastructure down to the real estate. And it's not a small fact that to get the data, tech bros are all into building smart cities. Google started a real estate division. Like we're talking about an incredible penetration and vertical integration of these corporations. That conversation seems very, very separate from people's individual experiences, or even how we talk about attention economies. And I guess right now the challenge is to try and unite them, but that's really hard. People have a hard time sensing or feeling or visualizing their data being taken from them to train some AI.
But is there an argument where, I guess it would be read as accelerationist, but what would happen if everybody sought to train these models, sought to give their data, knowing that they were training the machines for the future? Like, is there a narrative where that makes sense? Or would you refer back to this idea of the mandate and that this technology isn't inevitable, there are other pathways, and that by giving our data, we're just consenting, not to our data being used, but to a future that the human will be increasingly edged out of?
And for starters, I want to say the human is never edged out. These systems serve people, okay? Mm-hmm. And they're built by people. So for starters, I don't think there's any edging the human out, but there is inequity and dispossession and extraction of value from certain humans versus other humans. I like to say that AI isn't actually a technical revolution. Anyone who studies the history of computing is like, oh, all this stuff has been there for a while. There's always the question, why suddenly it has this visibility and discussion? And my argument is that actually it's not so much a technological revolution as it's an organizational one. It is actually about particular organization of that data run by particular institutions. It's obviously a reorganization of everything from energy. If you think about the server farms and the infrastructure just needed to do this. So you're seeing a massive reorganization using this technology. The real issue is how do you maintain a diversity in institutions and organizations? So an educational infrastructure that is not just run by OpenAI or Google Education actually does manage a lot of the school systems, especially in the global South now. Mm-hmm. So, how do I keep it that maybe I spend some time online and I use it, but I also enter another institutional framework where I have to reflexively think about how I wrote my paper with ChatGPT and whether or not that information is true or false, or whether a narrative is constructed. There's also an aesthetic question, which is like, I can prompt little images, but where else do I go where I see images that don't look like that? Mm-hmm. There really is here a question about how do we come to appreciate diverse forms of experience? These are seemingly unimportant, but actually are really fundamental questions. And it can also get to things that we don't usually think about, like what's the relationship between telecom providers and these companies? Mm-hmm. Do we keep laws that they're separate? What do we consider as the public good? What are the regulatory infrastructures? All of these things that are happening at every moment all the time. Microsoft's buying nuclear power plants. Does the energy grid stay separate from Microsoft? Mm. This seems like an interesting question, but to me, that's a fundamental question about how you're actually going to organize this technology. And for me, that's more important than whether I'm feeding the data. I am feeding the data every time I use this stuff, and I don't have anything against it, by the way. I also think I'm not a technophobe. I think we can do great things with AI. I have a lot of projects on AI in the healthcare sector, and I can tell you, in a stressed out healthcare system, a lot of places we need the AIs to help us read scans or process so much data just so people can get care. But obviously, if all of that AI is owned by Palantir and we privatize the whole healthcare and hand it over to an organization that doesn't care about care, then you have a problem. And so I think that the question here is going to be about whether we maintain democratic institutions, let's say, separate from corporate ones, whether we maintain different infrastructural organizations, how we deploy anti-monopoly law, how we also, as users, attune ourselves aesthetically to wanting different experiences. That's the problem with the discourse right now, is like, oh, it's AI or nothing. It's either we're Luddites or we have to love this. Mm. And actually, as lots of people have argued, it's never been that. Luddites weren't against technology. They were against technology without workers' rights and getting paid,
Yeah.
Maybe to go back in history a bit, I've heard you discuss this process of moving from Enlightenment reason to this post-war rationality, and then rationality becomes succeeded by smartness. Are these in some way like three stages of metamorphosis from human cognition to a computational or algorithmic cognition? It might be helpful if you briefly define the distinction between reason and then the shift to rationality. We've kind of covered smartness, but I'd like to understand how that played out, how the models for what those words really mean were developed over time.
Well, for starters, I have to say I'm grounding a lot of my work in the work of people like Lorraine Daston and other historians of science who have tracked this history of rules and reason. I'm not an expert in the Enlightenment, but the way people have been thinking about this, and we have to think about it as a heuristic, like how do we think about what stays the same and what changes in the field of history? How do we identify what makes AI unique or not? And so we just create baselines, if you will, ground truths. I think a lot of people, whether it existed or not, argue that the Enlightenment saw the production of a particular notion, an ideal of the human, as a kind of contemplative character who could make what we call reasoned decisions grounded in empirical study and in many ways in certain forms of expertise. And a classic exemplar of this is Daston likes to talk about Goethe sitting in his garden, studying a flower opening in the morning to the sunlight and just spending so long contemplating this flower and witnessing nature until he's crying because of the sun and how intensely he has to look at this flower. And none of us can imagine sitting a couple hours in our garden waiting for a flower to bloom just to document the truth of nature. But that figure resembles, right, the opposite of our short attention spans, rapid decision making, calculated reason of the present, right? And then people talk about the emergence of what we call mechanical objectivity. You know, in the Enlightenment, we still had maybe a link to Renaissance thinking that, you know, the human and God were kind of aligned, that certain particular humans had godlike capacity to look at the world and understand it perfectly or objectively. And these were usually white, male Europeans, had this ability to survey the world as though they were not part of it. They weren't subjective. They were outside of it and could just see everything. And part of seeing everything is also maybe being able to command everything, right? So that concept, people argued in the 19th century, or with the rise of things like the camera and the photography and mechanical reproduction, people started to question whether people really could see everything perfectly, because suddenly there were machines that did it better, that could witness reality and see things like the Muybridge, you know, the famous horse running. That's stuff that we can't capture with our eyes. So suddenly the machine exceeded human perception and maybe in the factory human labor. The machines were faster, more automated. The discourse of modernity is people trying to stay up with machines. And in some sense, we still have that problem, right? The AI is always seen as ahead of us, right? That AIs can calculate faster. They can figure out problems way ahead of us, stuff like that. So that the problem of syncopating the human body and human perception and cognition to machines got inaugurated with the rise of what we call mechanical reproduction. And in turn, a new form of reason emerged, which was the expert, the scientist, the person who designed or made these things, the people who could understand or use these machines to find out about nature. So the expert, the reasonable person, became someone who could go out and photograph the world and use that data to understand the world. So basically, the people who built and supposedly commanded technology became the new measure of reason. And as I mentioned before, in World War II, there started to be even questions about that form of expertise and objectivity. And also there emerged this new machine that supposedly, in the words of Vannevar Bush, who headed the U.S. scientific endeavor during World War II, would work as we may think. And this transformed ideas, obviously, of the human and the machine towards this new idea of rationality, which actually made human intelligence and machine intelligence perhaps more equivalent, more commensurable, that the best decision maker became the guy who thinks really quickly, unemotionally, like tech bros have affect problems. They're autistic. They can't really relate to other human beings. They've got that feature. So these new features of the human, quote unquote, and again, I emphasize human as being an ideology, not a reality, is part of what we're talking about in this reformulation of rationality. And I would say right now we're in a new phase where, exactly like you say, there's both fantasies of networked cognition, but I think we also have to really try to understand how the fantasy of network decision making relates to also our fantasies about the uniqueness of certain tech oligarchs or what have you, because the two seem to be happening together, and that demands accounting. Like, why on one hand do we engineer systems to actually distribute responsibility? I think the best example of this is things like drone warfare, where you've got 10 different groups of people syncopated and like no one person's responsible for a decision network through their machines. And at the same time, we believe there are certain figures capable of making decisions. And in fact, we've also seen the return of the charismatic leader in authoritarianism. The question is that people responding against this vision of the networked intelligence and suddenly reifying some older bad idea of the human? Personally, right now, I think we're struggling to understand that, but it's shaping our politics. And I think part of our job is to say, hey, how can we embrace these concepts of networked, cyborgian subjectivities in a way that doesn't necessarily disempower us entirely, but also doesn't necessarily retrieve an older fantasy of centralized decision-making, authoritarianism, charisma, genius.
So last month, a 25-year-old man suicide bombed an IVF clinic in Palm Springs, California, and he left behind an audio manifesto in which he described his belief in a kind of extreme antinatalism called pro-mortalism. And over the course of this manifesto, he constantly invokes logic and rationality.
Okay, so I figured I would just make a recording explaining why I've decided to bomb an IVF building. Basically, it just comes down to...
If you're hearing this message, you've completed the first step towards becoming a New Models member. To continue, visit patreon.com/newmodels or newmodels.substack.com. A complete library containing hundreds of rare New Models episodes awaits.